And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the one, the only Shanti Jones. You all know Shanti by now because she has been prominent in our movement for quite some time. And we never know whether she's going to read to us or sing to us, but Shanti has pioneered the cabaret philo around the world. She's been a great entertaining artist as well as a philosopher, treating us to original musical themes on all kinds of philosophical topics. She's published regularly in APPA's journal and other places. Shanti is a certified counselor in private practice in Taos, New Mexico, which used to be a quiet place and now I think is being overrun by tourists. It's been discovered. Whether that's good or not, she'll tell us. Shanti has written numerous articles on philosophical counseling and practice for peer-reviewed journals. She performs cabarets, and the most recent one is What It's All About, which deals with the meaning of life. She's a regular cast member in the Taos Children's Theater as well. She has lately been discussing literature in philosophical counseling. Have a number. Vana has just published a piece on the Elizabethan era, the Renaissance, using Shakespeare as a source of philosophical counseling. And Shanti has presented and published a paper on all kinds of literary works which can be used during the pandemic to help people find their way through. And today she's going to talk to us about complex moral narratives in philosophical counseling, insights from Henry James. Shanti, the floor is yours.
Well, in some ways, I would have been well if I could have started right after Carolina, because my talk really takes off on all of the insights that she shared about how aesthetics can be utilized in philosophical counseling. So what this talk will do is to show specifically how Henry James and his works, I use them as aesthetic experiences in my philosophical counseling practice. So I would like to suggest that the works of Henry James is an American author who spent most of his time in England and is the brother of William James, the founding father of modern psychology, are very well suited for this job. For James, moral knowledge was not just an intellectual grasp of theories. Rather, he believed it was important to illustrate what responsible action in context-specific and nuanced situations looked and felt like. And I think this is really important because I find so often in our publications, how these moral situations look and feel is often left out. I'm not sure if it's because people don't feel comfortable sharing it or because they don't have that much experience helping people to work through these larger complex narratives. But his vigilant attention and intense regard his characters display towards their unique but universal situations are always represented as moral acts. James understood that the writer's task is a moral one. Questions about justice, well-being, moral realism and relativism, the concept of the person, emotions, and desires, to name only a few, are addressed by him from many sides. While philosophers tend to write about morality in terms of propositions, a writer like Henry James brings his imagination and feeling to moral issues in eloquent and perceptive ways, making his works useful adjuncts to philosophical counseling. This presentation provides you with a brief introduction to the life and works of Henry James and his philosophy, and it also includes a discussion of the ways in which philosophy and literature share similar concerns, and shows how the study of one can augment the other. Cases in which my work with clients was informed and enhanced by reading and discussing novels and short stories written by James will be interwoven with descriptions of the ways in which his works and thought enriched my thinking and improved my ability to reflect upon some of the moral dilemmas involved. Whoops, why isn't it changing? Somehow, there it is. So Henry James is considered by many to be one of the greatest novelists in the English language. His novels deal with conundrums which occur in social interactions between the old world and the new. And some of his best-known works include The Portrait of a Lady, Wings of a Dove, The Golden Bowl, and The Beast in the Jungle. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 3 times. James was an avid proponent of the literary realist tradition, which claimed that a text must principally represent experiences as they occur in real life. It must contain a representation of life that is recognizable to its reader. One of the ways James accomplishes this is through his characters and the situations they face, which, like reality, are frequently ambiguous and overlaid with contradictory motives and impressions. So this gives you an idea of his oeuvre overall. And I had so much fun while I was working on this topic because I read all 110 of his works in the process, and every one was a pleasure. So James made a rather unfamiliar use of the term moral. He wasn't principally concerned with a code of ethics. For him, to take life seriously is to be moral. His morality is concerned with a serious involvement with life and the attitude that life matters. For James, moral knowledge was not simply an intellectual grasp of propositions. In the world, with its complex, concrete reality, morality means responding to it in a highly lucid and sensitive way. It means taking in whatever is in front of oneself with imagination and feeling. The character's vigilance, his or her silent attention, the intensity of his or her regard are all put before us as moral acts. Having grown up during a time when Puritanism was being pushed up against by the naturalist movement, James, in his considerations about how to achieve the highest good, often sets the demands of duty and stern literal judgments in opposition to the need for a clear-eyed consciousness and honest self-knowledge. These forces often contend for the domination of his heroes' and heroines' souls. James narrates experiences of people who are committed to value. His characters chart their courses through situations which bewilder and unsettle them. He richly conveys their bewilderment and their indefiniteness. It is here where their essential moral choices take place, choices which demand a sacrifice, choices with which we can identify and which we can admire. James's characters are responsible to standing obligations. Will respect for human integrity be honored? Will the natural development of an individual character be permitted and encouraged? Will emotional cruelty or human connection win out? The moral dilemmas James' characters face are not softened or averted. His heroes and heroines do not indict society or blame God. Rather, they regard such predicaments as universal and inevitable, accepting them as conditions of life. How to achieve the summum bonum, or the highest good in life, is a recognizable Aristotelian concern shared by James. To respond at the right time towards the right people in the right way is as characteristic of excellence for James' characters as it was for Aristotle. This is another way that James's novels can be seen as a paradigm of moral activity. A very clear ethic in James's works is suffering is essential to growth. It is the means to knowledge and wisdom. The more insight one derives from it, the more growth there is. Because knowledge and wisdom are the goals of all of James's major characters, situations in which suffering occurs are ultimately affirmed. Through them, James shows the reader that pain is not the deepest thing. There is something deeper, an idea that is also expressed in many philosophical traditions, starting with the Stoics. In sum, for James, morality starts with the individual who is both finally aware and richly responsible. In order to be moral, the person must be clear and to lend their utmost intelligence to the situation they are in. He or she must respond to it with sympathy and an active imagination. If there are conflicts, one should face them squarely and keenly. If life is a tragedy, see that. never for a moment closing your eyes or dulling your feelings. In the next sections, I will present 3 instances in which my work with clients was informed and enhanced by the work of Henry James. Cases involving a depressed 20-something woman, a marriage in trouble, and a young man set on denying his humanity will be interwoven with the ways in which Henry James's works and thoughts enriched my thinking about them and improved my ability to reflect on the moral dilemmas involved. In all cases, I'm not using the names of the real people involved. So, in Henry James's writing, nothing was more significant than the situation of women and girls. He had a lifelong draw towards strong, intelligent women and wrote about them with remarkable insight. Because they were not his personal main attraction, James was able to look at them in the way that other women do. It seems ironic that a man was one of the great fictionalizers of women's experience. For that reason alone, Henry James is worth reading for both women and men. James wrote about women who learned to live for themselves. Each of his heroines is a bold creation who provokes a quandary related to female development. By making complexly imagined young women the engines of his stories, James's narratives show how riveting the question of what a young woman will do and why can be. My work with 20-year-old Anne represents the story of a fragile, struggling young woman selfishly manipulated by her parents to be subservient to them, and how she came to matter to herself. It illustrates how Henry James' literary works informed the process and aided in its successful advancement. In this case, I utilized 3 of his works, which contain portraits of young women in their various stages of individuation, to help my client better understand her situation and to take steps towards becoming the subject of her life. In addition to raising Anne in a strict Baptist home and homeschooling her, both of which were developmentally limiting, her parents had done almost nothing to further her individuation. Anne's mother, in her desire to keep Anne dependent on her, unwittingly treated her as an object. Anne was allowed to do only what her mother approved of. To make matters worse, in disagreements between mother and daughter, Anne's father would side with her mother against her. This milieu left her with almost no support for her developing self. In addition, Anne's temperament was generally shy, unassertive, and unassuming, making it easier for her parents and others to manipulate her. Anne's parents were somewhat consciously training Anne to be a submissive and self-denying child whom they made to feel guilty for wanting or having anything for herself. Anne still remembers a nightmare she had when she was 7 of someone breaking and entering her room. Some part of her realized it was she who was being broken into. Her feeling of existing for herself, for her own vision, was lost even then. We agreed that our work consisted in restoring that vision. In the beginning stages of our work, Anne would often excuse or defend her parents' abusive behavior. Like many of James's female characters, despite her desire to act and to be free, Anne was not able to understand what her parents, her church, and society in general had done to her. I hope that by giving her James's short story, Europe, to read, she would find a reflection of her perverse situation, one that would motivate her to comprehend the narrative of her life more fully and deeply and clearly, with the aim of becoming the subject of it. In this story, a parable which warns of the dangers of cloying mothers, Mrs. Rimmel, a widow with 3 grown daughters still living at home, tempts them for years with the possibility of a trip to Europe. Finally, after many delays, the trip is planned and they're all ready to go. However, just before they leave, the mother has a seizure which prevents the trip from taking place. She never recovers enough for the girls to feel comfortable leaving her. The eldest daughter eventually manages to make the break to Europe and never comes back. This makes her already demented mother more demented. The second daughter dies, having given up on the prospect of freedom entirely. Looking haggard and aged, The third daughter stays to care for her wretched, dying mother, who James calls the old witch. Anne enjoyed reading this story and the process of learning from it. It gave her an imaginative portrait of a situation like hers. She might not have been able to see her blonde-haired, blue-eyed, attractive mother as evil, as a kind of witch, but the parallels were clear. Through our dialogues, she has been better able to grasp how damaging her mother's behavior had been to her and began to separate herself from it. In addition, she began making better choices about how and when she interacted with her parents, choices which continue to lead her closer to becoming the subject of her life. A part of the individuation process does involve going against, but how does a woman go towards? How is she to go about freely choosing her vision? Is it free to be me? However ill thought out that is? Is it freedom to follow the path of consumerism, offered today as the sure way to happiness? Is freedom free sex? To complicate matters, the means of obtaining real freedom, the freedom of being the subject of your own life, remains obscured. Anne was homeschooled, which gave her the illusion of freedom accompanied by the pain of exclusion. She gained liberty at the expense of company and even identity. This meant her freedom was theoretical, meaningless to her because it was not accompanied by some understanding of what her available choices really involved and meant. It is no wonder then that faced with the pressure to make concrete choices, she recoiled. With no sense of her own importance, she lacked willpower to act on her own behalf. Thus, she had no power to resist whatever evil influences came her way. Because of his understanding of the ways a woman becomes the subject of her life, along with all the difficulties which makes that task uncertain, and because Anne had gotten a lot out of reading Europe, I suggested we move on to reading and discussing another of Henry James's work, Daisy Miller. I thought it would provide Anne with an understanding of some of the difficulties she was up against. Like Anne, Daisy is young, pretty, naive, and innocent. Like Anne, Daisy's parents had not prepared her for life in society. Like Anne, she was isolated and vulnerable. Due to each one of them leaving home, they were both physically, albeit not psychologically, unconstrained by their parents. Neither had been given tools which would enable them to become the subject of their lives. This precarious situation eventually led to Daisy's demise. I hoped Anne's reading of this narrative would frighten and illuminate her while helping her to avoid a similar fate. Through Daisy's negative example, the imperative to develop into being the subject of her life became clearer to Anne. I felt more certain that her situation could resolve in her favor than I would have otherwise. Through our discussions of Daisy Miller, Anne became better able to envision a path forward that would ultimately give her greater agency and to begin to construct it. Philosophically speaking, this is what adult deliberation is and should be. At 20, Anne was still mostly potential. She didn't yet have enough autonomy to clarity to signify anything clear-cut. Although we were making progress, I wanted her to grasp more fully the possible consequences of her having almost totally acquiesced to a life in servility to her parents. I wanted her to realize how her life, which deserved to be freely individuated, had been appropriated, leaving her with an empty notion of young womanhood. 6 months into our work, Anne was still struggling to break out of the chrysalis she was in. On her own, she was still not able to think or to feel too much of anything. She needed an ongoing encouragement and practice with relevant tools to help her move away from being passive and private to being active and social. Since my other two reading suggestions had proven to be fruitful, I suggested to Anne she might like to read one of Henry James's most important novels, The Portrait of a Lady. I thought she would recognize herself in its heroine, Isabel Archer. They are similar in that both have some intentions of their own. Having left home, both had a feeling of being free. I hoped Anne, like Isabel, would come to realize that freedom is meaningless unless it is accompanied by some understanding of what the available choices really involve and mean. The portrait of a lady provided us with just the platform we needed to help us address why such adult choices and commitments are necessary, how they are made, and how and why one must follow through on them. Understanding, consciousness, and a knowledge of how to make rational choices based on her preferences were what Anne needed and will continue to need to become the subject of her life. As she learns to perceive, to see within and beyond images and appearance, I hope her feelings and understandings about these things will become active and living rather than theoretical or repressed. I hope she will insist on being treated as the subject in her life rather than the object in others. I hope she will refuse to be appropriated. I hope that as she continues to grow, Anne will insist on a relationship with the world on her own terms. As is the case for all people, the script for Anne's life was not written in advance. Like all of us, she will heroically have to improvise her role as she goes along. The wisdom she has accumulated through our exploration of these works of Henry James is already proven to be an invaluable resource to her. Charles was a polite, athletic, handsome 42-year-old, the kind to whom most women could easily be attracted, and they were. Herein lay the root of his problem. The lure of having affairs with alluring, vulnerable women was becoming greater than the desire to remain in his 15-year marriage, which had produced a daughter, now 12 years old. He came to see me in hopes I could help him figure out what to do, stay or leave. Henry James portrayed human beings as a set of relations between forces, those that pull us towards agape or brotherly love, and those that pull us towards self-love. In our encounters with life, we become admirable or awful creatures by the use we make of those forces in our day-to-day experiences. In his mature works, James's major characters are often torn between such forces. Through them, he illustrates how one can remain moral and noble throughout complex situations, especially when one takes time and is thoughtful about doing so. Almost immediately, I saw Charles's situation reflected in that of Prince Amerigo, one of the four main characters in what is James's greatest work, The Golden Bowl. Like Charles, Prince Amerigo was a handsome, empathetic male who found it easy to form a sense of himself on his ability to subordinate women sexually. Like the prince, most of Charles' manners were delicately and tastefully based on that power. Neither man was fully conscious of the fact that they were greedily using women. Seducing women gave each a sense of identity that seemed easy and convenient. Although these veritable Don Juans did not want to admit it to themselves, the women who subordinated themselves to them were emblematic of a kind of greediness which grew out of need and which, sooner or later, inconveniently showed up. The similarities between the two men and their situations prompted me to suggest that reading The Golden Bowl could be helpful to him while he figured out what he wanted to do. For one thing, James used the limited viewpoints of his characters to make a banal situation like an extramarital affair intriguing, which makes his novels inherently a good read. Also, if Charles recognized himself in Prince Amerigo, I hoped he would be led towards some of the same questions the prince confronted. What is it to love within marriage? What are my values? Who should I consider? Charles went into his affairs unabashed. Like so many people, his affairs didn't seem tawdry to those involved. The forbidden aspects only made his affairs even more exciting. Perhaps seeing a situation once removed would enable him to gain a larger perspective on it. The problem for both Charles and the prince was their lack of a moral sensibility. This is a classic Jamesian situation, one of the person who encounters his other selfish, self-centered self in the house of life under the aegis of fostering love. As the person advances through the circumstance, depending on what he decides to do, he ends up either liberated or defeated. Throughout the duration of our work, Charles, like Prince Amerigo, would be determining the direction of his moral or immoral actions. Would he continue to flirt with passions which gave him an identity in his own eyes? Or would he accept the heavy burden of creating an individuality that could hold the complexities of love while finding creative solutions for them? Between Henry James and my client, man's possibilities, crimes, and sorrows were being played out. Henry James made it clear that we are going to become admirable or awful creatures by the use of our experiences. Having read the novel, I knew which way the prince had decided. In Charles' case, which would win? His conscience or his greed? At the beginning of our work, Charles reported experiencing a heavy and deep discontentment. He was having an affair, not the first one. He felt defeated in his marriage, respected neither by his wife Marilyn nor their daughter Susie. He said he would rather do almost anything than be with his wife. Everyone in the family was shut down. The thought of staying seemed horrifying to him. At the same time, the thought of leaving his family, along with the work it would take to rebuild his life, was daunting. As so often happens in a marriage, the love Charles had started out with became subject to his sexuality and to his greed. He was not a bad man. Although he did not realize it yet, he was foolish to have reduced his identity to sex and selfishness. If Charles were to do the right thing by himself, his wife, and his daughter, he would first need to be awakened to a moral perspective. He would need to know himself and his values better. He would need to find his moral compass. In addition, he would need to invert his feelings about women, including his wife. Instead of allowing them to define his relationship to himself, he would have to define it for himself, which at the beginning of our work was almost unthinkable. As we worked together, Charles came to better understand himself. He also came to understand the importance of his wife and daughter in helping him to fulfill his self-understanding. This, for me, was the great accomplishment of our work. Charles was able to examine the feelings, beliefs, and thoughts that he had come in with at the beginning. Through our dialogues and studies, he was able to undergo a change that was handsomely commensurate with the change in his point of view, which became a moral rather than a selfish one. He moved from enduring defeat and depression to enjoying and appreciating love and acceptance. In doing so, he reported feeling more cultivated. The golden bowl became a propitious vessel, helping both of us to hold a balance between his good faith and his immersion in his worldly dilemma. Through the conduit of Henry James's novel with its illustrations of people becoming square themselves, Charles was better able to trust that I would see his problem from a wise perspective and be able to help him with it. It is a sad truth that not only do we have to see our other darker self in order to adopt love as our informing principle, but also that seeing only happens after a long train of greedy and righteous errors. For Charles, it was the love of his wife and daughter that would accomplish this. Up until our work together, he had not accepted his moral responsibility to himself, nor correspondingly to his family. He had not even known what to make of these things, since they seemed to preclude his being somebody, a possessor, a man who gains his self-esteem from women. Through our work and the work of Henry James, it became possible for Charles to see the self-limiting character of a life lived under the aegis of worldly folly and selfishness. During our time together, he underwent a death to selfhood and was able to face his other self in the presence of saving love. Something went out of him so that something else could come in. Without much of a sense of loss, Charles gave up his affair and returned home. For the first time, he stood in need of and desired what he and his family alone could give. With dramatic precision, the work of Henry James helped me to be a better guide for Charles. Like Prince Amerigo, he portrayed a moral hero in the world, and I had the privilege of participating as the story unfolded. All the while, I was in awe of the process. Love and wisdom became allied with Charles's moral hardiness and his courage to act. What he endured along the way was a death to himself, along with the ensuing pains of forming a self with a conscience. He endured what anyone who has traveled the hero's journey knows, the pain of denying oneself. During our work, Charles was forced to confront what Henry James called the real thing and to bow to it. Just as Rome wasn't built in a day, Charles is still learning how to enact his good character under situations that try him. His wife and his daughter, after all, are far from perfect. This means he must accept humanity, both his and theirs, in all its wickedness. To do so, he must at times deny his selfish self, which is hard, even for the best of us. We were fortunate to have Henry James to show us that this is at the heart of the task of anyone who seeks redemption. How do you help a 33-year-old intelligent, good-looking young man who presents himself as confused and unable to understand how he could have ended up so bitterly unhappy? How do you help him to untangle the mystery of how he got to this place with the aim of arriving at a more deeply satisfying one? By the end of our first session, I inferred from all he had said that Ken's difficulty lay in his unwillingness to fully commit himself to both his work and his love lives. Although he wasn't consciously aware of it, this was the unresolved dilemma I understood him to be in. After we met, I considered the highest good that Ken and I could achieve in our work together. For me, if he could become conscious of this potentially hazard dilemma and motivate himself to change, a very good outcome would be achieved. That sounds well and good. However, this would potentially be tricky, given that he was prone to using flattery and pleasant talk in an attempt to cover over the fact that he was unreliable because of his lack of willingness to bind himself to the tasks and people in front of him. How could I get past his facade? Henry James thought deeply about the ways in which avoiding human connection impoverishes experience. People want to be free, but the possibility of being unrestricted doesn't exist in reality. Rather, freedom exists only in the making of specific choices and commitments. We've heard that a lot today. Although Ken couldn't articulate his goals due to the fact that he did not as yet understand the root causes of his difficulty, upon reflection, I thought if he could reject the stasis of the state of affairs in order to become the subject of his life by creating a world which would yield peace and satisfaction for him, this would be a good outcome. I chose Henry James, with his interest in the same kinds of circumstances Ken was facing, to provide the ideal essential framework for helping him to obtain greater depth and clarity about it. The Beast in the Jungle, one of James's best-known novellas, and one which deals with these issues, was the work I chose to assign to Ken in the hopes it would help him to achieve this outcome. In this novella, John Marcher, the protagonist, accidentally runs into May Bartram, a woman he had met 10 years earlier. Although he only vaguely remembers meeting her, and then only after being reminded, she still remembers the secret he revealed to her then. He told her that for a long time, he had held the belief that his life was to be defined by some catastrophic or spectacular event lying in wait for him, like a beast in the jungle. May decides that she will live her life alongside Marcher's, in part because she loves him, and in part because she is waiting to find out what fate has in store for him. Although Marcher admires May, he believes he is precluded from marrying anyone in order not to subject his imagined wife to his spectacular fate, so he does not let her get close to him. Marcher allows the best years of his life to pass. Eventually, he learns that the long-awaited misfortune was the act of throwing his life away while ignoring the love of a good woman. Both tragedies were the result of his preposterous sense of foreboding. When I assigned Beast in the Jungle to Ken, I hoped his major theme of life and love lost due to an unwillingness to commit to one's own particular reality would strike a resonating chord within him. I hoped it would help to make him more conscious of the possible fate that lay in store for him if he didn't strive for a higher good than behavior that often involved unexplained withdrawals and belligerent responses. Ken had a commonly held desire to escape the limitations of conventional social norms and to exist outside recognized structures. He had not yet appreciated that that desire is opposed by the awareness that he exists in a social world. His sense of self cannot be created in a vacuum. We've heard that a number of times today. It is only created through being recognized by others and by his own recognition of others. To this point, Ken had been unwilling to communicate his idiosyncratic sense of self and existence. Many people act thusly because they are afraid doing so will limit and define them. Tragically, what ends up happening is that they are simply not recognized. They become people without qualities, real nowhere men. The avoidance of making commitments created tension within Ken. Specifically, he vacillated between escape and rejection of existing social structures and attempting to change and to control them. It would only be by forming a personal vision and acting upon it that Ken would become the subject of his world. With the help of Henry James, we began to investigate this dilemma with its many complex implications. What we know is individually acquired and understood, and it continually changes. This makes it hard for the individual to see and use his or her perceptions wisely. The perceptions of a sensitive and intelligent person, such as Ken, can often be more pure or real than those of people who have a more conventional understanding of reality. However, this can be both a blessing and a curse. Such a mode of experiencing the world can threaten the individual with madness, a fear of being wrong, and with isolation. This was the state Ken was in when we began working together. In order to be what he thought the world expects, he concealed his feelings and responses. By doing so, he isolated himself, while his recognition of himself as an impersonal object for others increased. As a result, he believed that the more you give of yourself, the less of you was left. There are always people to snatch at you, and it would never occur to them that they are eating you up. Intelligence and sensibility can remain an excuse for isolation and a retreat from love and involvement. But at the time I met him, Ken had determined not to be himself, which had depersonalized him further into an object of pity. Among the ways Ken resembled Marcher was how he allowed anticipation to rule his life. Someday, success would be his. In the meantime, nothing else was good enough, which ended up making him emotionally detached from the situations he was in and from others. Like Marcher, Ken didn't want to involve a woman in his fate, both because a woman could get hurt and because in his mind, his fate was meant to be a solitary adventure. Thus, Ken ended up hurting a very deserving woman he refused to let himself love. Beast in the Jungle suggests that being in love means supporting the other person and being vulnerable with him or her, things that Ken wasn't yet prepared to do. It raises issues having to do with the nature of love, which I thought would be of value to discuss with Ken. He was still influenced by the temptation to be led into battles by his ego, rather than putting his inferior emotions under the guide of more enlightened ones. He still needed to learn that if he was stubborn and unyielding, he would be harmed. It is well known that Hollywood and Madison Avenue have created phantasmagorical images of love. These days, it takes much maturity to realize that it is neither earth-shattering nor it is passionate. The burden of caring for the other and of ultimate loss is mostly left out. Ken was not immune from imbibing these false images. making it more likely he was rejecting the real while waiting for an ideal that doesn't exist. Not only in Beast in the Jungle, but in also many of his other works, James raises the issue of the nature of courage and cowardice in love. He makes it clear that real courage means facing the unknown, including the unknown feelings a relationship can invoke. I was hoping that by being referred to this particular novella, Ken would come to see that, although he was an intellectual giant of sorts, he was a coward when it came to love. The wise person practices awareness. Being aware is the starting point for all we can do to improve ourselves. However, it takes space to feel and to reflect. To be aware, we must pause and take time to possess ourselves, to square ourselves with ourselves, as Henry James was fond of saying. Without preaching, I wanted to reflect to Ken his mostly unconscious difficulties, in part because his opinions regarding commitments had no firm basis in reality. He would need to learn that he must have firm reasons which were true, or his visions would be no more than dust in the wind. Henry James painted a picture of a little situation, the figure of a man who hasn't lived, who doesn't feel his sensations, neither his impulses, his desires, nor his pleasures. In the end, he never really enjoyed life, and the reader is left with the sense of lost possibility. In sharing this sad tale with Ken, I hoped it would help to guide him to a happier ending. Although we are still in the early stages of our work, it is easy to see that Henry James has deepened and clarified it and has left his impression upon Ken, stirring him to find another, better, and more moral way. Philosophical counseling needs literature. Abstract philosophical theories alone cannot convey the individual nature of moral decisions. They cannot articulate the varied tensions and discontinuities that are typical of the doubt, contradictions, and disjunctions people encounter in their struggles towards the good life. The world of literary texts, particularly when carefully chosen for an individual client, can open a wide horizon of possible experiences, which can reconfigure his or her world when given one or more of them to read. So I want to thank you for this opportunity. And to quote Henry James, the three things in human life that are important, the first is to be kind, the second is to be kind, and the third is to be kind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shanti, for a wonderful presentation. I'm wondering if everyone is speechless or needs to be for a moment. You've really also wrapped up much of, as you've mentioned yourself, ad lib. You know, you've wrapped up a lot of what was brought up in earlier talks today. And let's give Shanti a well-deserved virtual round of applause, which I'll take a snapshot of. If you could show yourselves and give her a hand, we'll include this. We're going to have one heck of a collage made of all of you doing this, and somehow or other it'll turn into a massive group photo at the end of the day.